Hi, my name is Dale Schultz, and I consider myself a lifelong resident of the Brooklyn area here, and what I would like to do is share a little bit of the Brooklyn story through what I used to call the Brooklyn Walk. So we're going to take stops around town, and as we stop, we'll look at what present day Brooklyn looks like at that location, but I'll tell you a story or two from that location that just brings back some of the wonderful past of Brooklyn. And for the Brooklyn kids who came here, it was kind of a parting gift for them, because I always wanted the Brooklyn kids to feel proud coming to school here, and they're part of the Brooklyn story too, just by coming to this school. So I hope you enjoy this little walk around town and some of the stories you'll hear. I'm walking down the tracks right now in the middle of town, and imagine back in Brooklyn's past, there were 4 sets of tracks running through Brooklyn. Right now, we see 1 set of tracks. So as we walk on the tracks, I'm looking over at Railroad Street, and that first building, a local business, long ago, that was where one of the grocery stores was located, called Odegaard's Grocery Store. And then the next building is a dwelling, a private dwelling. That was the location of Brooklyn's post office. And the post office used to bring the mail right up to where the depot would have been at this location. And the postmaster would have come up here at night, and they would have hung a mail bag right next to the depot, and the train would come through at night, and there'd be a big hook on the wagon where the mail would be hanging from the post office, and they would grab the mail bag off of the hook. The train wouldn't even necessarily stop, and they would pick up the mail bag and they would throw the mail to be delivered in Brooklyn right out on the platform of the depot, so that the postmaster could walk down the hill here from the depot and take it to the post office so that it could be delivered to the people in town. Continuing on the walk, the next building, another dwelling in town, that used to be the location for what was called the Old Northwestern Hotel. And that building had 3 different levels at that hotel. And at one time there was actually a fire on the 3rd level, so they still used the bottom level and the middle level for the hotel. The final building that you can see on the corner, another dwelling, that used to be a livery stable. When people came into Brooklyn or were traveling through Brooklyn, they were still with horses and buggies back then, and they needed a place to put their horses up for the night. The people would come over to the hotel, and then their horses would be taken care of next door. Cool thing about that location is, after the horse and buggy kind of disappeared, cars started to replace the horse and buggy. That place used to sell Studebaker cars right here in Brooklyn. Another cool thing about the cars coming through, the very first car supposedly that traveled through Brooklyn was actually in a cross-country road race, and Brooklyn just happened to be on the course. So now, as I'm turning to the north, this grassy area right along the train tracks here, this used to be the location of a huge grain mill with elevators, where the local farmers would all come from all surrounding Brooklyn. They would bring in their grain. Sometimes they just brought it into the mill just to have it ground up into feed so they could take it back home to the farms. But a lot of farmers would harvest their crops, and then they would be stored in these elevators, because that was going to be their income for their year's work on the farm. And a terrible thing, back in 1882, these grain elevators caught on fire. Brooklyn didn't have a fire department at that time, so they depended on just the local residents to form what was called a bucket brigade. And what they did is they had reservoirs of water stored throughout town, and they literally would bring buckets of water carried one person at a time, handed to the next person, and they would use that bucket brigade to try to fight these terrible fires. As the word would spread that there was a terrible fire going on in Brooklyn, help would come as far away as Evansville in Oregon to help those people fight these fires. We're walking up Commercial Street now in downtown Brooklyn. And so you're going to have to use your mind's eye here as I kind of point out the businesses from Brooklyn back about 100 years ago. So right around this spot right in here, this location I'll call it, this would have been where the Gamble's store would have been, and there was a Gamble's hardware store, and down in the basement there was actually a restaurant. And as we continue to move forward, the next building next to the Gamble's store would have been the Brooklyn State Bank. And so we're moving along, and you can see modern day State Bank of Cross Plains, which is overlapping on the original bank's location. The next store next to the old Brooklyn State Bank would have been a store that would have been called King's Clothing store. And next to the King's Clothing store, we would have crossed and walked into Schneider's Meat Market. And that would have been in this location. And now Schneider's Meat Market was kind of neat because it was all local animals that was processed and brought to the meat market. And they used to hang the meat carcasses right in the meat market on hooks. And people in town would walk into the meat market and they would order their cuts of meat. And the folks at Schneider's would have actually cut those cuts out and delivered them to the people's homes. This location here, this empty lot area, would have been where the drugstore Brooklyn would have been. It had several names, from Dietz Drug Store from the early days to Ellis's Drug Store to Fink's Drug Store. One interesting fact about the drugstore is the very first phone booth in Brooklyn was located in the drugstore. And later on, there were a total of 50 phones in the Brooklyn Village, but if you wanted to use a phone at a local place, you would go to the drugstore. And then finally, this store that's still standing here, this would have been the Brooklyn Mercantile Store. Later it became Armstrong and Roberts, and it was basically a general hardware store and a grocery store. So we're turning the corner from Commercial Street, and now we're entering Hotel Street. And as I look across the street, this building right here on the corner actually is the location of the very first business of Brooklyn that used to be called Axtell's General Dry Goods Store. It has been a lot of different stores throughout Brooklyn's past, from grocery stores to a restaurant. Upstairs, there were a couple sisters that lived upstairs a long time ago, and they were dress and hat makers. And these young sisters, when they used to go to people's houses to make their dresses and hats, they actually lived with those families for that entire week until their dresses were all finished. One of the sisters, her name was Mame, she was engaged to be married. And her fiance had a terrible accident and died. And that young gal was so saddened with the death of her fiance that she went back up into her apartment and didn't come out for a couple weeks. And when she finally reemerged to the community, her brown hair had turned pure white through the grief that she'd suffered with her fiance. This used to be a couple different locations. The part right across from me where I'm standing used to be where a post office was, and next to it was what the Brooklyn folks used to call the old Legion Hall, later became Severson's Diner. And the Severson family actually lived in the back side of their diner. And then next door, the small white building, that used to be the barber shop, and I remember going there to get my hair cut. And then next to the barber shop is the Anchor Club. Now, the Anchor Club has some pretty interesting history because that has served several purposes throughout Brooklyn's past too. if we gaze to the upstairs of the Anchor Club, that upstairs used to be where people would go to watch movies and hold dances, and it was called Hanson's Hall. And in 1936, WLS actually broadcast their radio program from that facility, and a lot of the local people came and actually got to be part of that WLS radio broadcast. The downstairs, a local pub. It used to be a hardware store and a restaurant. And one last thing that's an interesting fact about this building is that's where they used to play basketball in Brooklyn. As a matter of fact, that's probably the first indoor basketball facility that Brooklyn had. This building next to me was an automotive service owned by the Mortensen family when I lived in Brooklyn. And finally, we're at the end of Hotel Street here, where on this side of the street, this house was actually the location of the Brooklyn Hotel. And the street out here, Rutland Street, used to be kind of a main road for people traveling. So they actually had this location as a hotel for people who needed to stop and rest, and across the street was the livery stable for their horses. This is the original Village Hall of Brooklyn, and downstairs would have been where the first fire department would have been located. Now, this building served a lot of purposes over its history. The first library was actually housed in this building with a grand total of about 390 books. When the school burnt down in 1908 at the park, some of the kids actually attended school in this place after the school had burned. We're at the community building right now. Follow me and let's go on inside. We're in the community building now, and this was built in 1938 as part of the WPA, the Works Projects Administration. The WPA was designed to build public buildings for communities. Once this building was constructed, now the school had a facility where they could host athletic events, their proms, all of their school functions came here to this place. This community building is exactly what it is. It's the community building for the purpose that it serves so many functions. It has hosted countless weddings, funeral memorial services in the basement. Even as recent as right now, they have family movie night where families come in here and they'll put a movie up on the big screen out there on the stage so families can enjoy time together. Once again, just something that's so special about Brooklyn. This is the area of Brooklyn where there used to be some pretty large businesses. We had the Duplex Windmill Company that was established in the 1880s. And then later it became the Capitol Chair Company, and they created chairs. These buildings had to serve some other purposes. So they remodeled some of the old stone buildings, and they created what they called the Armory. The Armory was actually a place where they held dances and where they started playing basketball games. Now, the really interesting story about the Armory is this was back in the early 1900s, and Brooklyn had a basketball team called the Brooklyn Tigers, and they were nicknamed the Team. For 2 years, they had won 42 out of 47 games. The UW Badgers actually scrimmaged the Brooklyn Tigers in a game, and the Brooklyn Tigers actually beat the UW in a scrimmage game. And that team, it was kind of a home talent team. They used to play teams from Milwaukee and Beloit, as well as the local towns, and they were quite the team. The basketball team it was interesting. They didn't have a locker room inside that Armory building, so they actually used to hustle across town to the barber shop and use the barber shop as their locker room, change into their uniforms, and then hustle back to the Armory to play their games. So we're standing here on the corner of Hotel Street and Commercial, and we're kind of wrapping up the Brooklyn Walk right now. I hope you enjoyed some of the stories that we were able to talk about and share with you. There's much, much more with Brooklyn's history, and I invite you to come visit. And I hope that we can continue another portion of the Brooklyn Walk at another day. So thanks a lot. I'm Dale Schultz, and I want to give special thanks to the Brooklyn Area Historical Society, Sue McCallum, Sharon George, Paul Douglas, and Leroy Larson for all of the artifacts and all of the memorabilia that allows me to share those things and be the voice for the Brooklyn story. Bye-bye.